Um, and in France, things happened a little differently. Romanticism well, you saw last time in dealing with Goya, I discussed the period he was in, at least at the beginning of his career, which was the Rococo period. Well, in France, the Rococo period gave way slowly to classicism because the French painters, a lot of serious French painters got tired of Rococo. They found it just too frivolous and too decorative. And they fell back on classical art, which is something that painters have been doing since the Renaissance. A classical art influenced by Renaissance art. And the exemplar of this was Jacques Louis David. Now he comes from a very a wealthy, well-connected family. His father is killed in a duel. His mother then gives him to his uncles to raise and goes off on her own. David had to fight to become a painter because they had other plans for him. And he eventually is enrolled at the Louvre, which at this point, well, the Louvre, which began as a castle and then became a royal palace, with the advent of Louis XIV, became a repository for the royal collection of art. And because Louis XIV moved his entire court, of course, to Versailles. But they also set up the French Academy in the Louvre, and artists who were considered worthy were allowed to study there and were allowed to also copy the immense collection of art that they had at the Louvre. So Louis David studied there. He had a hard time gaining the kind of recognition he wanted. He tried for the Prix de Rome on 4 occasions. The Prix de Rome was a prize given to the most, what the Academy considered the most worthy artists. And whoever got it went to the French Academy in Rome and got to paint there, sometimes for several years, and send their paintings back to France. He kept trying. He got so angry at one point for being refused that he went on a hunger strike. But on the 4th occasion, he won the Prix de Rome. This is one of the paintings he did as a result of that period. You can see that he very early on embraces a very pure form of classicism, and he's a very intellectual man. Everything is, and he's very steeped, like most Europeans, especially highly educated Europeans, in the classical world. He sees everything through the lens of classical history. And this is important to understand because he becomes extremely involved in the French Revolution in a way that's rather shocking, actually. But this is before the revolution. It's the oath of the Horatii, who were 3 soldiers chosen by Rome to represent them in a battle with 3 soldiers from the city of Alba. The 2 cities had decided, rather than fighting a war, to have their disputes decided by battle of 3 warriors from each side. These are 3 sons, and the father is making them sign an oath, or swear an oath, that they will either win or die. And it's a very masculine scene, and it's the classicism is very obvious in the static nature and horizontal and vertical nature of the composition. The 3 sons in the left-hand panel, the father in the middle panel, and the the wives who are already horrified at what's about to happen and don't seem to have much agency in the whole thing. The death of Socrates, which also increased his fame, was very popular in Paris. He was very popular, but he was a little bit controversial because this was the beginning of the full-scale classicism in French art, and not everyone liked it. This is an interesting painting. This is Brutus, not the Brutus of the Roman Civil War. This is a Brutus from the beginning of Rome's history, and he was the founder actually of the Republic. He helped overthrow the monarchy that preceded it, and he founded the Roman Republic. And in this scene, his dead sons are being brought back to his home. He condemned them to death because they tried to restore the monarchy. So he's sitting here in a very troubled state while his wife and children grieve the loss of the sons that he had condemned. This, however, foreshadows a role that David will take in the French Revolution. So it's interesting to look at it now. And again, when the French Revolution comes along, he reads it in terms of classical history. Trying to get this to move, and it won't move. Oh, there we go. Whoops. Well, France was, France had bankrupted itself supporting the American Revolution, which seems a little counterintuitive because it was an absolute monarchy, but they were driving a thorn into the side of the British in their support of the American Revolution. But the problem was the American revolutionary ideas spread to France and combined with the Enlightenment ideas that already existed in Europe. And as conditions worsened in France with food shortages, famines, and the middle class losing a lot of its wealth in the ensuing crisis, the middle class and a lot of the upper class gathered together to form a constituent assembly, which was finally held in the Jeu de Paume, where they played tennis at the time. It was held here because the Royal Guard refused them entry to the building they had wanted to hold this assembly. This is a painting by David, which isn't finished because he was very much a part of events. He was a member of this constituent assembly, and he wanted to record history. So he started this enormous painting. But events were now moving so fast. The oath that everyone took at the Jeu de Paume to create a constituent assembly and maintain it till they got what they were demanding was swept aside in the rush towards revolution. So he never finished this painting. But he was a very close friend of Robespierre and Marat, and actually was on the committee that signed the death warrant for the king. And probably for the queen. No, I'm not certain about that. I know he signed the death warrant for the king. His wife left him over that. His wife was furious with him. But he was an ardent Republican who felt that they had to move forward and they had to get the obstacles out of the way. Marie Antoinette, shortly after the king was guillotined, she was sentenced to the guillotine. He did this sketch as she passed under his window on the way to the guillotine. And actually their treatment of her, as much as I'm not a royalist, I think their treatment of her was pretty awful. So here he is sketching someone who's a victim of the terror, which he is actually a member of, because he is, along with Marat and Robespierre and other members of the committee, actually deciding who will go to the guillotine. This is the death of his friend Marat. Marat spent a lot of time soaking in a bathtub because he had a very serious skin disease and he was incredibly uncomfortable except in water. So he did his work in the bathtub. A woman came to his house, said she had a list of people who were plotting against him. The wife, against his wife's advice, he admitted her. She gave him the list. He told her that people would be executed. And then she stabbed him. And he died almost immediately. David was also involved with all the festivities, the fêtes that the revolutionary government created. And he created a huge staged funeral for Marat, in which Marat was laid out holding his pen. And but it took so long to prepare this funeral and the public viewings that he started to stink, and they had to douse him in vinegar and also hold the final interment a day early. But this is a brilliant painting, and he makes Marat into, it's been called a Pietà of the revolution, because it's a very classical painting that references the dead Christ. It's really, it's a stunning painting. Okay, as the revolution continues, starting to devour its children, Robespierre is arrested by those who are tired of this reign of terror, and he's guillotined. And it's only because David missed a meeting of the committee that he wasn't taken to the guillotine that same day. But he is jailed, and he's jailed on 2 occasions over the next year. And it's his wife who left him over his signing the death warrant for the king, who finally prevails on his jailers and the authorities to release him. Well, David, who thinks of everything in classical terms, paints this painting. This is the story of the Sabine women, who, you know, were in the rape of the Sabines, were seized from the Sabines by the Romans so they would have brides. Well, the Sabines waited 2 or 3 years and then decided to attack Rome and get their wives back and women back. But the story is that at this point, the Sabine women had children, had become part of Roman society. So at the point when the battle is about to start, they intervened and they stopped the battle. And he paints this as a tribute to his wife, who had intervened to save him. Now, a very strange thing happens. The revolution takes another turn as Napoleon takes charge and gradually gains power within the government and ultimately becomes dictator. He befriends, well, I think actually David befriended him. Now, at first, of course, Napoleon was seen as an agent of the people and someone who was spreading revolutionary ideas throughout Europe. So it made some sense that David would befriend him. And he was given the commission by Napoleon to paint him going through the pass. See, I've got to, let me find that one. Oh yeah, St. Bernard Pass, and surprising the Austrians and having a great victory. The truth is that Napoleon went through that pass on a donkey. So David is becoming a propaganda painter for the new regime. And this, to me, is a shocking painting. David, who was so much of a Republican that he would sign the death warrant for at least the king, maybe the queen, is now commissioned to paint the coronation of Napoleon. And he paints it. I mean, it's a complete turnabout. It's a very well created painting. He did an immense amount of research. He even got the Pope actually posed for him. And Napoleon didn't pose for him. Napoleon never posed for him. He had to use other people's likenesses of Napoleon. Napoleon was too busy. But Napoleon absolutely loved this painting and gave him a big bonus. As you can see, he would like it. I mean, it's a splendid celebration of grandeur, imperial grandeur. The empire style. I mean, David was one of the people who actually created the empire style, the way people dressed. And it was a direct reference to classical clothing. But this has another significance, this painting. This is Delacroix's elder sister posing in this painting. Delacroix, who would be sort of be seen by the classicists as an enemy of classicism. The classicists, David and the other classicists, were ideologues. And they didn't think any other form of painting was acceptable. Okay, Antoine Jean Gros studies with David, but at a certain point, a little bit before the revolution gets crazy, at a certain point flees France because he's concerned for his own safety, and goes and spends a year or two in Italy, mostly in Geneva. While he's there, he meets Josephine de Beauharnais, who becomes Napoleon's wife. And through her, he meets Napoleon, and he's present at a battle in near Geneva, the Battle of the Bridge of Arcolay. And he witnesses Napoleon raising a standard over the bridge during the battle. So he paints this painting, which of course, because of his association with Josephine, Napoleon sees. And Napoleon, of course, is very flattered by this painting and invites Gros to join him on his campaigns in Africa and the East, the Middle East. And Gros goes apart from being allowed to sketch the campaign, which he does, he's also, his official capacity is one of those who will assess the art and antiquities that Napoleon will plunder and bring back to France. So he spends 2 or 3 years with Napoleon on his campaigns in Africa and the Middle East. And when he comes back, he paints paintings to celebrate some of the occasions. This is a very famous occasion. Napoleon besieged Jaffa, and it was a terrible fight to gain control of Jaffa. His 2 emissaries that he sent to parley with the leader in Jaffa were tortured, and their parts hung on the city walls. So when Napoleon finally conquered Jaffa, he put all of the troops of his enemy to the sword, something like 1,500 troops. Meanwhile, his own garrison caught the plague. And here he's shown visiting the plague victims. And this is, again, a propaganda painting. Though, well, I'll say what I'm going to say in a minute, but he never actually touched one of the victims like this. And in fact, he did meet with them, but he told his doctors privately that when the army left, they would poison all of the patients, which didn't go over well when people learned this. So this is a propaganda painting showing how concerned he is, and concerned beyond any concern for his own health. It's to give him a sort of empathetic quality of a great leader. It's a magnificent painting, I think, and it betrays something about Gross, which was to plague him. He was taught by David, and he was very much in the classicist camp. And he never left the classicist camp. He felt it was his job to defend it against the later romantics. But if you look at this painting, it has the elements of a romantic painting as well. It's much less stilted and static than David's work. And there's a very strong emotion which doesn't exist in David's work. And this next painting, the Battle of Aboukir in Africa, North Africa, near Egypt, I would say could pass as a romantic painting, but he never goes further in this direction. He moves back to pure classicism. And well, wait, let me go back a second. And his work becomes more and more sterile. He loses because some people believe it's because Napoleon, who was his hero, gradually divorces himself from the people. And he could no longer really sympathetically paint Napoleon. And his paintings become more and more stilted. They receive worse and worse reviews. And finally, late in life, he becomes completely dissipated and drowns himself in the Seine. One more of the classicists, perhaps the most famous in some ways, Jean-Auguste Ingres, because many modern artists have a high regard for him. He was a dyed-in-the-wool classicist and very, very conservative, a royalist, actually. You can kind of see it in the severity of his expression here. This is a self-portrait. It took him a long time to advance. He spent years in Italy because he wasn't getting the recognition he expected in France. He did get the Prix de Rome, but after getting it, he stayed in Italy in 1806. He stayed in Italy to 1824, sending paintings back which were not well received in France. But finally, in 1824, and interestingly enough, this is with the restoration of Louis XVIII, he sends this painting to Paris, which is really well received, and he returns to Paris. It's it's known as the vow or the oath of Louis XVIII. To me, it's kind of a sterile painting, brilliantly painted, but he was, for much of the time he lived, all those years in Italy, he did portraits, and he was a utterly brilliant portraitist, as you can see in this painting. A master draftsman, he's always been respected for that, who believed that painting derived from line, not color. He was to have the same argument with Delacroix that Michelangelo had with Titian when they met, which is painting begins with line and color is subservient, whereas both Titian and Delacroix maintained the opposite. He's famous for his odalisques, which utterly enchanted. There was a retrospective of his work in 1905. And the modernist painters, Matisse and Picasso, were blown away by his work. And of course, Matisse does endless numbers of odalisques. The odalisques, apart from being very beautifully painted and very harmoniously arranged, are also evincing this new interest in France in the East, the Orient, which becomes more and more of an obsession with French artists, like this painting, which also has, by the way, you see there's really lovely color in this, but the color is obeying outline. And you don't see a lot of variation of the color within any particular form. Line and modeling predominate and dominate the composition, as well as a very static arrangement, usually of horizontals and verticals. This painting is, I think, a beautiful example of his portraits, which were high society portraits for the most part, but done with immense finesse and simplicity too. This was one of his last paintings shortly before he died. He lived quite a long life. And it was, it shocked Parisians when it was first seen, and it was hidden for many, many years. It was in a private collection. It was finally shown in 1905, and Picasso just went crazy when he saw it. He loved it. It's kind of an outrageous fantasy in our eyes, I think. I mean, Ingres never saw the inside of a harem, which is what this is. And the women are awfully pale skinned. Very much of a male fantasy. But I don't know. If anyone has any reactions to these as we go along, you're welcome to say something. This one maybe in particular, because it had a huge effect on modern artists, Matisse and Picasso and others.
It's more of a cartoon than the real, like a portrait.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, even his portraits, he simplifies a great deal. But here, yes.
Looks very
To me, excuse me?
Looks like a Botero, like some Botero aspects in there.
A little bit. Yeah, well, Botero was probably influenced.
Yes.
Ingres' drawing and figures, female figures, were incredibly influential.
Right.
To me, though, it's the beginning of, I mean, there's two things. There's the Orientalism and there's the fantasy. There's the beginning of a sort of escapism, which characterizes a lot of modern art, actually, which comes out of artists feeling the unbearableness of contemporary events and times. In this case, I don't think that's what it was, but, well, I don't know.
What's crazy about the previous work, there's really amazing detail in the fabrics.
Yes.
Like there's you have to like really look for it, but they detail the flowers are really crazy.
Yeah.
Like I'm like drawn to the headscarf. Like first thing I saw was that. It's crazy.
Oh yeah. Well, he's put the bright, this brightest light is here, just on this one figure. It's just off center.
Like the purple, below her with the guitar.
Yeah.
You have to really, it's really crazy detail. It's almost like hidden. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the tea set or whatever it is in the foreground here too. That looks like a coffee cup, actually. The coffee did come from the Middle East. Anyway, it's a fantasy. I'm not sure that harems ever looked anything like this. Okay, this is a very important figure in the transition, the beginning of the rise of Romanticism in opposition to the Classicism. Theodore Géricault. He doesn't live a long life, unfortunately. I'm just looking my notes here. I want to make sure I have my notes on Géricault in front of me, and I can't seem to find them here. Well, I don't necessarily need them, so. Oh, here we are. Yeah. He has he comes from a modest family. He's not a particularly healthy man. Both he and sorry, I'm just dropping names here. Sorry, give me a second to collect my thoughts here. He and Delacroix both have TB. Not, I don't think in Delacroix's case it was in the neck and throat. In Géricault, I don't know. He was somewhat frail. He also suffered from a number of injuries because he was a fanatical horseman and was thrown a number of times, and it actually led to his early death. But he first studied under a classicist in Rome, the same classicist who taught Delacroix. But Géricault, who was a very passionate, emotional person, couldn't stand the dryness of the teaching and finally dropped out and went to copy paintings of the Louvre, which he did for several years, actually, which was a possibility in those days. You didn't have to travel at this point because Napoleon had brought back so much booty from all over Europe, especially Italy, that you could study all the masters in the Louvre. He was disappointed in his reception after this. He had an immediately positive reception with this painting when he showed it. But his next painting, which was also a horseman, but a wounded horseman, was panned. And he was so upset that he stopped painting and enlisted in the cavalry at Versailles for a couple of years. And while he was there, he drew and painted and studied horses. Then in 1816, to flee a romantic relationship with his aunt, he heads for Rome, Florence, Rome, and Naples, where he comes in contact with the Renaissance painting, and he's particularly blown away by Michelangelo. And he says of this scene, "Michelangelo sent shivers up my spine. These lost souls destroying each other inevitably conjure up the tragic grandeur of the Sistine Chapel." Well, about this time, he returns to France. About this time, there's an event. There's a shipwreck of the Medusa on the coast of Africa. Because the captain, it was headed for Senegal. The captain was incompetent, and it was to create a huge, it was a huge controversy in France. And he took advantage of this situation to paint this painting. He was, of course, himself very impressed by what happened because the ship ran aground. There were 400 passengers. Lifeboats were only available for 250. it's such a familiar story. It's hard to believe that it kept happening over time. But so there were 150 people without a lifeboat. They built, the ship's crew built a makeshift raft and put those 150 people on the raft. And then I believe it was five lifeboats were tethered to it. And the idea was they were going to drag it, they were going to row it down the coast till they got to their destination in Senegal. But in fact, it proved so difficult, they just cut the ropes and left the raft drifting and went on to Senegal. So the original 150 were left on the raft. They were there for 13 and a half days without food or water. Within a few days, there was fighting. Some people were killed. There was cannibalism. And I think by the time they were discovered by the Argus, which is this ship, this little tiny pyramid in the very distance there, there were like 15 living people still on the raft. He spent a year doing research for this, interviewing the survivors, reconstructing the raft, going over all the events. What he actually painted was not one moment, because the moment that they saw the Argus and the Argus finally saw them and came to their aid, the ocean was still. It was a clear day. But he wanted to paint the terror and the danger that they were in. So he put them in this stormy sea with these big waves, which they had experienced. Also, at the point that the Argus arrived, there's no record of there being any bodies still on the raft. Two of the survivors are actually in the painting, here in the painting. Some of the painting has darkened considerably because he and Delacroix would use a lot of modern colors. And one of the colors they used was a coal tar derivative, which over time darkened the paint, bled into the paint around it. This figure here conjures up the Sistine Chapel ceiling in Michelangelo to me. It seems like a clear reference. This figure here is significant because it's Delacroix. A lot of the figures in this painting were Géricault's friends who posed for him. And Delacroix, being his friend, was one of the people who posed for him. And this was the first time Delacroix got to see this painting in progress. And he said he was so excited by what he saw that he ran all the way home to his own lodgings afterwards, because it opened up a whole new way of painting. It is the opposite of the static, romantic paintings that we've seen before. And there's a huge diagonal moving through the painting like this. There are also two pyramids, one created by the mast and the other created by the sailor who's trying to signal the ship. He spent a year painting this. And as I said before, he painted it one person and one object at a time until he'd finished the whole painting. This is his palette. Interestingly, the blue never appears. It appears only in mixtures to make a very muted green. But it had a profound effect on the public and made him extremely famous. This woman, after some research, I found out she was the wife of one of the officers in the stables of Versailles. So he probably painted it when he was in the stables, frequenting the stables. There's a horse's saddle here. So it may have actually been painted in the stables, or else maybe they kept their saddles at home. I don't know. But it's a beautiful portrait. It shows what a fine portraitist he was. Well, as I said, he was not healthy. He had a lot of sickness. There was also madness in his family. And before he died, he painted a whole series of portraits of mad patients, of a doctor that he knew who gave him access to the patients. And to me, they're just utterly stunning paintings. Very empathetic.
Gorgeous.
Very detailed. And it reminiscent, as you remember, when we were doing Rembrandt and Frans Hals, Frans Hals did the same thing. He painted a mad woman in an asylum that was associated with his family. So that's, but again, what's also interesting about this is these are clearly not painted for the public. Much like Goya, he's painting a lot of his paintings just to please himself. But he has another injury from falling on a horse and gets sick and dies at a young age. His friend Eugene Delacroix, on the other hand, who's somewhat younger, lives a pretty long life and definitely builds on Géricault's work. This one is called The Bark of Dante. It is Dante being taken into the Inferno by his guide Virgil, if you've ever read the Divine Comedy. And you can see references here, not only to classical painters, but to Géricault's Raft of the Medusa. But this painting, Delacroix takes up the same challenge that Géricault did. He takes a historical event. He was very, very concerned, as were most progressives in Europe and romantics in particular, with the attempt by the Greeks to liberate themselves from the Turks. And what he's painting here is the moments before these Greeks were massacred by the Turks. So it also, in some ways, I think it bears some comparison with some of Goya's works. It's a very powerful painting. Gross, who himself committed suicide because of all the bad reviews he was getting and his failure to advance as an artist, called this a massacre of painting. He really didn't like it because it violated all the classical canon. But we know that after he'd painted this painting, Delacroix made one of his 2 trips. He only traveled twice in his life, once to England. And in England, he met some of the English landscape painters, in particular Bonington and also Constable. And he altered the background of this painting as a result of what he'd seen. This was a study, is believed to have been a study for the figures in that painting. But to me, it's just a marvelous portrait. And you can see here the difference between a romantic portrait and a classical portrait. There's emotion is of supreme importance to the romantics. They're empathetic and emotional in the way they deal with their subject matter. Delacroix was an avid reader, and one of his favorite writers was Byron. He read everything Byron wrote, and in fact, Byron, was a great champion of the Greek fight for freedom. Byron ended up going to Greece to put an army together, but died of fever in a place called Missolonghi. Missolonghi is the subject of this painting. Missolonghi was eventually overrun by the Turks, but before they could overrun it, the citizens of Missolonghi had destroyed their city and committed mass suicide. So this is Greece expiring on the ruins of Missolonghi. It's a, she's a symbol of the suffering and what's happening to Greece. Now this is an extravagant painting that I actually don't like very much. It's Delacroix at his most extreme. Again, it's interesting. It's a poem by, he's basing it on a poem by Byron. And Sardanapalus was a potentate who was condemned to death, and he ordered he ordered those he was in command of to slay all his concubines and all his slaves before he himself died. It's a weird painting because it's a horrible subject, but it's sort of celebratory and very exciting to look at. So I think it's romanticism at its worst, though brilliantly painted. But that's just my opinion. What do other people think of it?
It's a little kitschy.
Yeah, it's a little over the top. But this one, this is the most famous of all of Delacroix's paintings. It was painted in 1830 when there was a popular rebellion against Charles X. And in fact, he was forced out of office, and it was the end of the Bourbons in France. But he was replaced by another king. So, but there was a revolution, there were barricades, and this was Delacroix's way of celebrating and showing his support for the people's uprising. And of course, this symbolic figure of liberty here, which also bears some relation to the Statue of Liberty, if you think about it. The idea of
a little different
classical garb being liberty, Yeah. But it's also interesting because the Romantics, as opposed to with the classicists, there's this male thing, this super male thing in everything, whereas the Romantics tend to put females forward as exemplars of freedom and liberty. There's a lot of carnage here. It's apart from her, it's a pretty terrifying painting. But the painting, like most of his work, received mixed reviews because at the point that he released it, the monarchy was reestablished, and the establishment didn't really like this painting very much. Okay, in 1832, he's invited to go on a diplomatic mission to, from Spain to Tangier, to excuse me, to Morocco and Algeria. Algeria had just been conquered by the French. And this is, and he also went because he wanted to see somewhere other than developed Western society. He wanted somewhere more primitive, more traditional. And he was drawn also by the lure of the Orient, which has become very powerful in France. These are fanatics who are a religious group running through the streets of Tangiers. And he took voluminous notes, sketches, and he produced huge number, I think 70 paintings after he returned to France on the subject of Algeria and Morocco. And they're really very interesting paintings. And I think they gain a lot from him being a first-hand witness rather than just making it all up like Ingres. Now he had he couldn't, it was very difficult for him to, in fact, he wasn't allowed to sketch Arab women. He had trouble sketching Arab men. But he did manage to surreptitiously sketch some Arab women. I'll show you that later. But what he could sketch and do studies of were the Jews. And this is a Jewish wedding. and I think quite a lovely and quite evocative painting. He did some wonderful nudes, and again, there's this exotic quality that enters all his work. Very different though than the nudes of Ingres that we saw earlier. It feels alive. It feels like the person's about to get up and move here. There's a parrot down there. It's a woman and a parrot, you see. He loved literature and he loved music, and he drew most of his inspiration from these sources. He was quite a solitary man. But he befriended George Sand and her lover Chopin. And actually, these two figures were in one painting originally. So at some point, it got cut up. But these are very loose sketches of the two of them, probably when they were just hanging out together. But this is a very famous portrait of Chopin. And he continues to the end of his life doing these very exotic, romantic scenes. This is The Bride of Abydos, which is based again on a poem by Byron. And it's a long story, but it's basically a Romeo and Juliet story. They both die in the end. But here he's trying to protect her. It's very dramatic, quite a lovely painting, actually. And you can see his, I'm sorry, yes?
I was going to say, I liked the arc, the composition with the arc of the sword over her, like creating that arch with his arms.
Yes, yes. He's unable to defend her. He gets killed and she dies. She commits suicide, I believe. And the arch, contrary to this movement here, coming down from up here, you see, the arm is in counterposed to this movement. Incredible amount of movement in this, which of course was one of the things the Romantics, and also a real sense of the figures within a landscape. And the landscape has a living quality too. This one in particular, Christ in the Sea of Galilee, shows what a great landscapist he was. This is a shipwreck, but it's more of a landscape than anything. See a couple of people around the shipwreck and some more people in the cave here. But you can see here, you see him really prefiguring Impressionism in a painting like this. And you can see why the Impressionists were so crazy about him. Now, there's one thing I haven't said, because there's so much to say about him. He was the first painter, along with Turner, to study the color theories of Chevreul. Chevreul being the master of the French tapestries, Gobelin tapestries, who wrote a book on color theory, on the way colors influence one another, on complements and the way a color will induce its opposite in surrounding colors or intensify it. He studied this stuff and he applied it to his painting. This is the painting he did twice, once in the middle, well, fairly late in his career, and once at the end of his career. It's the women of Morocco in their own at home, and it's based on his surreptitious sketches he did at the time. This painting was loved by the Impressionists. Let me find what Cézanne had to say, because it's very interesting. If I can find it in my notes. Oh yeah, all this luminous color. It seems to me that it enters the eye like a glass of wine, running into your gullet, and it makes you drunk straight away. This painting, the second version of this painting was actually displayed in Montpellier, which is near Arles and not that far from Auvers-sur-Oise. So I don't know if Cézanne saw it there, but Van Gogh and Gauguin, while they were together, went to Montpellier specifically to see this painting. And Renoir, Van Gogh, Cézanne were all totally blown away by Delacroix's color, and often did paintings that directly referenced him, as did both Matisse and Picasso in later years. And this is the last of the paintings. That's the end of the talk. You know, it only took 57 minutes.
Oh, beautiful.